Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. In this episode, we're going to go back into the archives to find an answer to a question from an inspirational teacher. And for those of you who are hearing it for the first time, hopefully this points you towards an episode that you may want to listen to now. As you're listening, I think it would be fantastic to think about how you might respond to this question. And why not share it in the comments wherever you're listening, whether that be YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I hope it provides useful food for thought for your professional development this year. Without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. Our focus is going to be on spelling. I think it's fair to say, Lynn, that you think that the English writing system is often introduced to pupils in ways that can lead to spelling difficulties. Is that right or fair? And can you elaborate on this for listeners?
Yeah, I had to think about that. It's not so much as introduced. I think the English writing system, in a scheme where people have a high quality phonics scope and sequence, the introduction to the English writing system with a phonics scope and sequence is an absolutely brilliant way to introduce the writing system. I think what more I'm driving at is that sometimes, even though we get off to that fantastic start with phonics, it then gets kind of abandoned. The English writing system and the other layers are not just phoneme-grapheme correspondences, tend to get abandoned because, well, look, here's my hypothesis as to why that abandonment might occur. You can probably think of a time or a region or a group or a system that didn't have phonics and was doing things like balanced literacy or analytic phonics. You know, let's just take some random words and apply some phoneme-grapheme correspondences to that. There are times, and there still exist those times and systems where phonics isn't being used. When people started using phonics, the results that they got, and systematic synthetic phonics as a result of the inquiries into the teaching of reading over the past 20 years in the Anglophone world, when they started to do that, the relief was palpable. It's like, oh, I'm getting results. I'm actually filling gaps. And there's so many more children that are coming along for this ride of appropriate literacy development. So the relief is huge. And that, I think, has become the main focus. Just get them reading. But actually, English is a complex orthography. So although it does consist of phoneme-grapheme correspondences that are very reliable and quite easy and intuitive to teach with a good scope and sequence, there are other layers. And those other layers, I think, are neglected, especially if you just stay at the phoneme-grapheme correspondence level. That is, any letter sequence must be a grapheme for a phoneme. And that's actually not true, not in an orthography like English. English has other layers. It has morphemic layers. It has etymological layers. You know, there are some letter sequences that are there because of the story of the word, not necessarily trying to correspond to sounds. There are things like orthographic expectancies as well. Even simple things like, you don't use CK at the beginning of a word. That's an orthographic expectancy, and a good phonics program will tell you that. There are other expectancies, though. There are other things that are deeper. And if we keep trying to shoehorn phonemes and graphemes into one another, then what happens is children are forced to learn or try to learn, and unsuccessfully in a lot of cases, have these huge charts of this is a spelling for the sound blah, when actually there's a different thing going on with the formation of that word. And you can explicitly teach that too. So that's what I mean. It's not being introduced and causing spelling errors. It's that the actual spelling, not the encoding of sounds, is abandoned or not taught or left to chance. And I think we can do better. So that's my position on that.
I entirely agree. And I think there's an extent, well, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put this as a question because it's kind of my hypothesis on this, which is that I think that there has been like an overextension of what phonics is meant to do. So
Yeah.
people basically think that there's this English is not contains, but is full stop an alphabetic code, and that's all there is to it. And so our job is to teach phonics. Sorry, through teaching phonics, we're going to teach pupils the entirety of this code explicitly, and to not do that, even if in theory it were possible, is somehow negating our responsibilities as a teacher. We have to do this because if we're not introducing them to we're not introducing to all of orthography in the way that we should, when the reality is that phonics was never designed for that. Phonics was
Yeah.
just designed to introduce pupils to the most common bits of the most common correspondences of that code so they can learn the rest of it from real text experience. Does that sound roughly aligned with where you're coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I call it getting into the sweet zone. If you look at David Scher's work on phonological recoding, for instance, and self-teaching, he talks about, and again, lots of other research has been built on that hypothesis and shown to be a very efficient, effective way to get children reading, blending and segmenting, attaching phonemes to graphemes, and so on. It's a really, really important foundational step. You're absolutely right. And we want to get children very quickly to the sweet zone where they're self-teaching, where they have a sufficient phonological awareness. And again, a good phonics program is going to cover that and and sort of extend that through phonics lessons. We want them to get to that sweet spot where they are able to recode, phonological recoding, and figure out possible likely pronunciations for unfamiliar words. It's such a great goal. But the other part of this is writing. And writing, again, has been shown, and spelling, writing by hand, and so on, has been fairly convincingly shown to also help build lexicons, to build efficiency when it comes to recognition as well as recall of letter sequences. And when you start writing and when you start spelling, that's where the other layers come in. And the earlier and better you teach that alongside a good phonics program, the more efficient it is for a higher population of children. And I think we're totally agreed on that, Chris.
And I think this is probably where I think because the word encoding within a phonics program has got this correctly narrow definition of, oh, okay, right now we're writing down a word using a known set of grapheme phoneme correspondences. And the main reason we're doing that is to embed a pupil's understanding of decoding. Kind of makes sense to call that encoding. But if then that is thought of as, and that's what spelling is forever and ever, then yeah, it can be problematic. You mentioned David Scher. I think it's not surprising, or at least to my perspective, I don't think it's surprising that people who perhaps push back on these ideas about the wider breadth of English orthography are often those who are very, very keen on the work of Diane McGuinness. Really brilliant reading researcher, made huge contributions to the field, but she was, in early reading instruction, someone who was very skeptical of what she called late stage sight word recognition, or Airy's work on orthographic mapping, which has seemingly a pretty robust body of evidence behind it now. So I think it isn't too surprising, perhaps, that those that push back on some of these ideas are those that are see a lot of her work as gospel. Just a random aside there.
Now, gospel in the endpoint, and look, Airy's work didn't just have a lot of backing and support and so on, and was well researched. Work from that took place. So further research was embedded, on top of that, to over and over again show with finer and finer detail how orthographic mapping can and doesn't happen, And so the work that Airy came up with, and Kilpatrick and Scher, they all worked together at some point, has been built upon, whereas I don't think McGuinness's work quite underwent that sort of evolution. It was just very convincingly stated and rested on some excellent principles, but it couldn't be taken, or wasn't particularly taken further in the way that Cher and Arian and Kilpatrick's work has been taken.
I mean, as I'm listening, I have recognized that with it, certainly within the last 5 years, I've been a teacher who has held some of the misconceptions that arise from not really understanding this. Is this a rite of passage, and is the only solution to find out more about the process of reading and spelling and the learning process that happens, or can we do anything as school leaders to support our colleagues who may be in a similar position?
Well, I don't know about only solution, but I would always say that in education, the more you know about your subject or subjects, especially if you're a primary teacher, boy, you've got to know a lot of stuff. You've got to do the maths as well, and so on. But the more you know about those subjects and how those systems work, the easier it's going to be for you to impart that beyond your Dunning-Kruger expertise, right, to people who you might not be able to conceptualize as struggling with this because it's so easy for you. And spelling is a really good example of that. Yeah, you can get kids reading with some pretty poor instruction in phonics and some pretty low level theories and understandings, but you can't get them spelling very well unless you make it a lifelong journey, I suppose, to understand how words work. And it is a lifelong journey. 10 years ago, I wrote the first edition of Spelling for Life, and a lot of the things, I've done the second edition now, and so many things have changed. I'm not ashamed of that, and I'm still learning, as time goes on. So it's not the only solution, but it's a very good one. And one that I would want people to draw on, and move to, because I do a lot of the things that I say are to do with what I see as casualties. So I do run a practice, and I have children who, for whatever reason, struggle to acquire literacy, and mostly it's spelling. Even if reading is something that's not particularly problematic for them, a lot of them come to us because they cannot write legibly, quickly, and accurately. And some of that has to do with balanced literacy, for sure. But the ones who can read, I'm seeing casualties of approaches that say every letter sequence is a sound.
You've got a lot more experience, perhaps, of these really struggling spellers, or from my teaching experience, they were fairly rare, but they did happen where you'd have kids who were voracious readers who would score almost full marks on a comprehension assessment, but their spelling would be very poor indeed. And in almost all circumstances, not all, but almost all circumstances where I saw that fairly rare combination, the pupil in question often had issues relating to physical coordination. So handwriting was an issue. When I spoke to their parents, they occasionally said that actually there were just wider issues with gross and fine motor control. Is that a pattern you see at all? Or am I, from a very limited data set, over-interpreting?
It's definitely a pattern. And that would be, in the sphere of dysgraphia. So dysgraphia is difficulty not just with the mechanics of writing, holding your pencil and forming letters and writing neatly and quickly, but also with the text generation, the output, the next word, the next sentence, the next paragraph. So we see a lot of dysgraphic students, absolutely, but also we do see dyslexic students who don't have any of the motor issues, and the dyslexic students, basically, they constitute a large majority of the students that we see. Those are students who I'd like to sort of term as they have a potential. They have a potential that's for forming robust mental orthographic images. So putting words in their lexicon that they can easily, effortlessly recall. They have a very low ability to do that. They have a low potential. And no matter, how much you can explain the etymology and the morphemes and so on, you can move them towards their potential. But there are many cases of children where spelling is just kryptonite. It is just going to be the thing that breaks down when they're under pressure. And you've got adults in your life who are exactly like that. So forming those mental orthographic images for instant recall is in fact something that does exist on a spectrum of ability. And the more that we understand about how words are built and impart them, the better for them. But there will, no matter how good you are, there will be students who find it very, very difficult to spell as well. So it's not the same as reading. That's the other thing. that the maybe the sort of McGuinness influenced cohorts might have as an idea that speaking and spelling are reverse processes, and they absolutely aren't. You can be a brilliant reader, a brilliant orator, and still find it incredibly hard to bring a word from your long-term memory accurately onto paper under pressure, no matter what. And they're different. They are different beasts. They're really different things. So again, the solution for me always is to try to move people towards their spelling potential, whatever that might be, and to understand that there are limits to that. And knowing how words work helps to push their potential, in my experience.
Very quickly, thinking about what you say and your knowledge of this area, and reflecting on Kieran's phrase, a rite of passage, it does stand out to me that you have started off from a position of understanding linguistics, and it's kind of a lot of people I know who are interested in reading research kind of do the opposite journey. So they start off with schools and then practicalities, and they're into reading research as a result of that. And the more and more they read of reading research, they find themselves going, hang on a minute, I need to know a bit about this linguistic stuff, be it learning about phonology, be it learning about English orthography more generally, learning about semantics and syntax and this sort of stuff. And that's kind of the journey that I'm on. I'm now currently wading through introductory textbooks and bits and pieces on linguistics. It's a very short way of saying I'm just really jealous that I studied chemistry at university and not something that actually would have been valuable and interesting like linguistics.
I'm sure chemistry organized your mind in ways that make you the thinker that you are, Chris.
I don't know about that, honestly. I do not know about that. Yeah, no, Kieran's had too many conversations with me to